It was the winter of 1971 in a quiet mining town tucked deep within the Appalachian Hills of West Virginia. Snow covered the streets like a clean white sheet, masking the darkness that had been quietly festering beneath the town's calm exterior. The residents of Haverly Creek, population just under 3,000, knew each other by name. They shared the same church pews, bought their groceries from the same family-owned store, and waved to each other from porches that creaked with the rhythm of time. But on the morning of January 17th, that peace shattered. It started with a phone call at 6:42 a.m. to the Haverly County Sheriff's Office. A farmer named Walter Briggs, who lived just outside the main road leading into town, reported finding something strange in the creek that ran along his property. He thought it was a deer at first, tangled in the ice and debris that winter storms had pushed downstream. But when he got closer, what he saw wasn't an animal. It was the body of a young woman, half encased in ice, with her hair fanned out like dark ribbons against the frozen water. When Sheriff Alan Decker arrived, he stood still for nearly a full minute before saying a word. The sight was haunting, the young woman's eyes frozen open, her skin pale and translucent beneath the ice, her left hand clutching a silver locket as if it were the last thing she held onto before death. There were no signs of a struggle nearby, no footprints in the snow leading to the creek, and no vehicle tracks within 50 yards. It was as though she had appeared there from thin air. By noon, the news had spread across town. People whispered in the diner, in the post office, in the church halls. No one recognized her. No one claimed to know her name. The sheriff's department called her simply the Creek Girl. But as the body was transported to the county coroner's office, one man watching the stretcher roll by swore he'd seen that locket before. His name was Richard Lane, a retired miner and widower who rarely spoke to anyone. When asked, he quietly said, that belonged to the Miller family, their daughter, Clara. Clara Miller. The name brought back a flood of memory and silence across the town. Clara had vanished 4 years earlier, in the summer of 1967. She was just 19 years old, a bright, hopeful college student home for the holidays. One evening, after helping her mother close the family store, she left to meet a friend at the old church playground. She never made it home. A town-wide search had followed for weeks. Flyers were printed, the creek was dragged, and local hunters combed through the forest, but nothing was found. Her disappearance left her family broken. Her father, Thomas Miller, never recovered. He died 2 years later from what neighbors called a heart too heavy. Her mother, Ruth, moved to another town, unable to live in a place where every corner reminded her of her daughter. The case went cold. And now, 4 years later, the town had to face the impossible truth. Clara Miller had been here all along. The coroner's report that followed stunned investigators. The condition of the body, preserved by the ice and low temperatures, suggested she hadn't been dead for 4 years, only a few weeks. There were traces of a sedative in her bloodstream, and faint bruising around her wrists, indicating restraint. Whoever had taken Clara had kept her alive, somewhere, for years. Detective Samuel Greer, who had just transferred from Charleston PD, was assigned to the case. Known for his methodical approach and near-obsessive attention to detail, Greer immediately sensed this was not a typical small-town murder. The killer didn't just want her gone, he told the sheriff. He wanted to keep her. Within days, rumors spread like wildfire. People started questioning everyone, the man who owned the old sawmill, the pastor who used to counsel Clara, even her former boyfriend who'd since married and started a new life. The town that once united to search for her was now divided by suspicion. But the first real clue came from an unexpected place, a single torn photograph found in the pocket of Clara's coat. It showed her standing beside an unknown man in front of a cabin, deep in the woods. His face was mostly cropped out, but part of a sheriff's badge could be seen glinting on his chest. That discovery changed everything. The sheriff's office quietly went into lockdown. Files from the 1967 case were re-examined. And slowly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Witness statements that had been altered, evidence that had disappeared, and reports that were never filed. Someone within the original investigation had buried the truth. As Detective Greer pieced together the fragments, one chilling thought grew stronger in his mind. The person responsible for Clara's disappearance wasn't an outsider. It was someone trusted. Someone who wore a badge. But before he could take his findings to the State Bureau, he received an anonymous note slipped under his motel door. It read, in shaky handwriting, "Don't dig any deeper. She's not the only one." That night, snow fell again over Haverly Creek, covering the footprints of those who had walked in the shadows too long. But for Detective Greer, this case was no longer about a cold file or a forgotten girl. It was about a truth that demanded to be found, no matter who it destroyed. And somewhere, hidden in the darkness of that frozen town, the person who had kept Clara Miller alive, and taken others, was still watching. The next morning, the county sheriff's office was swarmed with journalists, locals, and state investigators. Haverly Creek hadn't seen this kind of attention since the mine collapse back in '58. Sheriff Decker looked tired, his uniform wrinkled from a sleepless night. He refused interviews and declined to comment, but the public didn't need words. The sight of the coroner's van leaving town spoke loudly enough. Detective Samuel Greer began his investigation with one principle: start with the silence. Whoever was hiding something in this town had stayed quiet for years. He needed to find out why. The torn photograph became his focal point. Using magnification, he noticed a small reflection in the glass window of the cabin, a rusted truck parked outside. That same truck was registered to the Haverly County Sheriff's Department back in 1968, assigned to Deputy Frank Collins. Frank Collins. A man who, in every sense, embodied the small-town ideal. Married, 2 children, active in church, always the first to volunteer during emergencies. But Greer's instincts screamed that something about Collins didn't fit. When he pulled Collins's old service files, he found a suspension notice from 1969, listed under misconduct and misuse of evidence. The details were vague, and the follow-up report was missing entirely. When Greer asked Decker about it, the sheriff avoided eye contact. "That was a long time ago," he said, tightening his jaw. "We don't dig up ghosts here." But Greer wasn't here to follow rules of silence. He requested access to the original 1967 case files, a move that made half the department uneasy. Inside the dusty archives, the truth began to whisper. There were inconsistencies everywhere, times on witness statements that didn't match, testimonies from key people missing pages, and an official search map with an entire section of the creek area deliberately left blank, the very section where Clara's body had been found. That night, Greer drove alone to the location in the photo. The cabin was barely standing, roof caved in, door rotted, snow creeping through the cracks. Inside, it smelled of mildew and ash. Dust coated everything, but the air felt wrong, disturbed. He swept his flashlight across the floor and froze. Carved into one of the wooden beams were the initials CM, Clara Miller. And beside it, scratched roughly with a nail or knife, another word, "Still here." Greer stepped back, heart pounding. On the far side of the room, something else caught his light, a small box half buried under the floorboards. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing Clara through the years. In some, she was smiling, clearly alive. In others, she looked terrified, eyes pleading. Dates were written on the back: 1968, 1969, 1970. It confirmed what the coroner had suspected. She had been alive for years. Greer returned to town and immediately requested Collins's address. He'd retired 2 years ago, living just 10 miles out near the old quarry road. When Greer knocked, Collins's wife opened the door, hands trembling, eyes wet. "Frank's not well," she said softly. "He doesn't remember much anymore. The war, the years on the force, they took a lot out of him." Inside, Frank sat by the window in a rocking chair, blankly staring at the snow. Greer sat opposite him, sliding one of Clara's photos across the table. "Do you remember this girl?" For a long moment, Collins said nothing. His hand twitched slightly. Then, in a voice cracked and low, he whispered, "She used to sing while she waited, every night." Greer froze. "Waited where, Frank?" Collins turned his head slowly. "In the room below the cabin." The detective's heart dropped. There was a cellar. He hadn't noticed one during his earlier search. Greer raced back that night with a team and excavation lights. Beneath a loose section of flooring, they uncovered a hidden trapdoor leading into a small underground chamber. The air was heavy, stale, and cold. Chains were still bolted to the wall. A single mattress lay in the corner, beside a stack of old books and a rusted lantern. But what sent chills down everyone's spine were the carvings covering the walls, hundreds of tally marks, and between them, fragments of words: "Day 27, sing, cold, please." It was a diary carved in silence. The media soon erupted. Every national outlet descended on Haverly Creek. Forensic teams uncovered evidence confirming Clara had been kept there for nearly 3 years. DNA samples and materials recovered from the site connected to several missing women from nearby counties. Clara, it seemed, wasn't the only victim. Collins was arrested, but the case was far from over. As he was taken into custody, he muttered something under his breath: "It wasn't just me, we all kept her there." When asked to clarify, he refused to speak again. Days later, Detective Greer uncovered what Collins meant. The fingerprints found in the cabin matched not just Collins, but two other active officers, both of whom had mysteriously resigned within the same year Clara vanished. One of them, Deputy Clara Weston, was now living under a different name in Kentucky. The other, Officer Neil Turner, had died in a supposed hunting accident in 1972. It became clear, Clara's abduction wasn't an isolated act of madness. It was part of a much darker conspiracy, one tied to an internal circle that preyed on vulnerable women, hiding behind the badge that was supposed to protect them. Greer's investigation now had reached something bigger than a local crime. It was a system of corruption that had survived through fear and silence. But what he didn't know then was that someone still alive was desperate to make sure the truth never reached daylight. 2 nights later, the sheriff's office went up in flames. The archive that held the old case files, the same room where Greer had found the blank search maps, was completely destroyed. The fire marshal's report claimed faulty wiring. But Greer knew better. Someone wanted to erase history. And the next morning, a package arrived at Greer's motel. No return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a small silver locket identical to Clara's, except this one had fresh fingerprints. Whoever had sent it was sending a message. The case had just reopened itself. The morning frost lay thick on the motel window when Greer opened his eyes. The silver locket sat on the bedside table, glinting faintly under the pale light. Something about it unsettled him, not because of what it symbolized, but because it looked too new. He carefully dusted the surface for prints, revealing partial impressions consistent with a woman's hand. They didn't match any in Clara's file. But then, in the hinge of the locket, wedged so subtly it almost went unnoticed, was a scrap of paper. Written in faint pencil were 3 words. Check the river. Greer drove out before sunrise, tracing the frozen path along the creek. The snow muffled every sound except the hum of his tires. When he reached the old bridge near the mill, he spotted a dark figure ahead, someone standing near the edge, staring into the water. It was Sheriff Decker. Greer approached slowly. "You out here early, Sheriff?" Decker didn't turn around. His breath fogged the air. "You shouldn't be here, Sam." "Why's that?" Decker finally turned, and for the first time, Greer saw fear in his eyes. "Because you're about to find what I've been trying to bury for 30 years. Before Greer could respond, Decker reached into his coat pocket and dropped something into the river. A badge. His own. That's when Greer saw it, a set of tire marks leading down from the hill, stopping abruptly near the riverbank. He followed them with his flashlight and found the shattered remains of a pickup's front bumper, with a registration tag that matched Frank Collins's old department vehicle. The vehicle hadn't been scrapped. It had been sunk. When divers were called later that day, they pulled up what remained of the truck, rusted, half-eaten by the current. Inside were human remains wrapped in cloth. But when forensic tests came back, the DNA didn't match Clara. It belonged to Clara Weston, one of the 2 missing deputies. Someone had silenced him decades ago. The evidence was undeniable, the same rope used on Clara's bindings, the same burn marks from the cabin cellar, and a bullet casing from a sheriff-issued revolver. Every thread pointed inward, toward the department itself. Greer cornered Decker in his office the next evening. "You knew," he said quietly. "You've known this all along." Decker sat behind his desk, face ashen. "I was a deputy then," he said. "Collins and Weston were my training officers. I thought they were helping the town, cleaning up trouble, keeping things quiet. But it wasn't about justice. It was about control." He leaned back, voice trembling. "When Clara went missing, we were ordered to stay quiet. The captain said she was trouble, said she had evidence against them. They called it a runaway. But I saw her. I saw her chained in that cellar. I didn't do anything." Greer's voice hardened. "You let her die." Decker nodded slowly. "I've been dying ever since." Then he pulled open a drawer and placed a folder on the desk. "It's all in there, the names, the payments, the transfers. But if you go after this, Sam, they'll come for you too. The people who started this are still alive." Greer took the folder. "Then let them come." Inside were documents showing a series of police cover-ups spanning 3 decades, a network of officers exchanging protection for silence. Clara's case had been the turning point, the one they couldn't afford to let surface. And yet, she'd left traces everywhere: songs, carvings, her locket, silent acts of rebellion against the men who took her voice. That night, Greer returned to his motel. He placed the locket beside the folder, turned on his tape recorder, and began dictating everything he knew. But halfway through, he noticed the light outside his window flicker. A silhouette moved across the parking lot. Someone was watching. He grabbed his gun and slipped quietly out the back exit. The snow crunched softly under his boots as he followed the trail. It led behind the diner across the street, where a black SUV sat idling. Inside was a woman, mid-40s, wearing gloves, eyes cold but intelligent. "You're Detective Greer," she said calmly. "I've been expecting you." "Who are you?" She handed him an envelope. "Someone who's tired of secrets." Inside were classified internal memos from the 1970s, each stamped confidential. They detailed how the department's missing person division had been disbanded to eliminate redundancy, but in truth, it had been erased to conceal evidence. "You've been digging in the right place," she said. "But you don't know who's really behind it. Deck is just a gatekeeper. The real man you want died 20 years ago, but his son didn't." Greer frowned. "Who's his son?" She hesitated. "State Senator Richard Vaughan." Greer's chest tightened. Vaughan had built his political career on law and order, pushing reforms to honor forgotten victims. He'd even visited Haverly Creek during the new case's reopening, publicly calling Clara's story a tragedy of justice lost. Now Greer realized the cruel irony. Vaughan's own father had been the captain who ordered Clara's disappearance. And Vaughan had spent his career ensuring no one ever found out. The woman's voice broke slightly. "My mother was one of them. They took her before Clara. She never came home." Greer's voice softened. "Why help me now?" "Because it's time someone made them remember." She handed him a USB drive. "This has everything: scans, confessions, letters. It's enough to end them all." Before Greer could ask her name, she stepped back into the shadows and was gone. The next morning, Greer turned everything over to the State Bureau. Within days, the story exploded. News stations across the country broadcast what came to be known as the Haverly Files. Arrests followed. 2 retired officers were taken into custody. A grand jury subpoenaed Vaughan. But the senator never made it to court. 3 nights before his hearing, he was found dead in his office, a gunshot wound to the head, ruled a suicide. On his desk, investigators found a single sheet of paper. No confession, no explanation. Just one line written in black ink. "She sang even in the dark." For Greer, that was the end of the official story. But in truth, there were no endings in cases like this, only echoes. He visited Clara's grave one last time before leaving town. Someone had left a small bouquet of wildflowers and a new locket beside her stone. Inside it, engraved in faint letters, was a message. "Every mystery leaves a voice." Greer closed it gently and whispered, "And today, we finally heard hers." Then he turned, the cold wind at his back, and walked into the falling snow, the sound of her song still faint in his mind, lingering like a memory that refused to die. Winter lingered long in Haverly Creek that year. The snow didn't melt so much as fade, leaving behind gray rivers of ice along the roadside. The town moved quietly, as if unsure how to behave now that its ghosts had names. Outside the diner, someone had hung a photograph of Clara on the notice board, the same black and white image that once appeared on missing posters. Beneath it, handwritten in red marker, were the words "She was here all along." The reopening of Clara Weston's case had shattered the illusion of safety the town once clung to. For years, Haverly Creek prided itself on being small, honest, and peaceful. But now, peace had become synonymous with silence, a silence that had protected murderers, buried truth, and kept families living in the shadow of a lie. Greer stood across the street, watching townsfolk pass by the board. Some stopped and bowed their heads, others turned away. Healing, he knew, was never uniform. He'd been offered commendations, even a promotion, but he turned them all down. "Justice isn't a medal," he'd said in a brief press statement. "It's a responsibility. And we failed her for too long." The FBI had reopened 3 other missing person cases after uncovering ties to the same internal cover-ups that silenced Clara. A task force named Project Echo was formed, dedicated to revisiting decades-old cold cases linked to departmental corruption. For once, the system wasn't just apologizing, it was listening. But for Greer, the case had left deep scars. Nights were restless. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara in that cellar, bound but still humming softly to herself, defiant even in the dark. It wasn't fear that haunted him, but respect. A kind of reverence for a woman who, even in death, refused to vanish quietly. One afternoon, months later, Greer drove back to the old Western farmhouse. It had been abandoned since the investigation concluded. The property was set for demolition, but before that happened, he wanted to walk through one last time. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp wood. The walls bore the faded imprint of photographs long removed. In Clara's old room, sunlight filtered through cracked blinds, falling onto a small patch of wallpaper where faint pencil marks appeared, almost invisible at first glance. Greer leaned closer. They were tally marks. Rows and rows of them. Days. Weeks. Months. At the very end of the wall, the last mark curved downward slightly, shaped like a note from a song. A melody frozen in time. He took a photograph and left quietly, closing the door behind him. Outside, he noticed a small wooden sign staked into the ground. Memorial Site, Clara Weston Foundation. He didn't know who started it, but the foundation's purpose was clear: to support investigations of missing women in small towns across America. Donations poured in from every state. Victims once forgotten were now being re-examined, their files reopened. In a press conference, a woman in her 40s, the same one who had given Greer the USB, stepped up to the microphone. She revealed her name publicly for the first time: Mara Vaughn, the senator's half-sister. "I can't undo what my family did," she said, voice trembling but steady. "But I can make sure no other woman disappears without a voice. This foundation is for Clara, and for every story like hers." The audience stood silent. Some cried. Others applauded softly. Greer watched from the back, unseen. When the cameras turned away, Mara walked off stage and saw him. For a moment, they simply nodded at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Both knew the cost of truth. Both knew it was worth it. Later that evening, Greer sat alone in his car overlooking the frozen river, the same one where the sheriff had once dropped his badge. The current below was slow and heavy, but steady. He imagined all the secrets that had sunk there, all the names lost to time. He opened his notebook, the one filled with case notes, and wrote a single line. "Every voice deserves to be heard, even the ones that come too late." Then he closed the book, placed it in the passenger seat, and started the engine. The road stretched ahead, long and silent, lined with the faint glow of streetlights disappearing into mist. As he drove, a song came on the radio, soft, melodic, old. The same folk tune Clara used to hum. He didn't reach to turn it off. He let it play. Because now, finally, her voice wasn't lost. It had become something more, a ripple that awakened a town, a truth that refused to stay buried. And as the snow began to fall again, Detective Samuel Greer disappeared into the horizon, carrying with him the weight of justice, the sound of a song, and the haunting peace of a mystery finally answered. There are stories that end with justice served. And then there are stories like Clara Weston's, where justice doesn't erase the pain, but teaches the world to listen differently. Months after the case closed, the small town of Haverly Creek began changing in subtle ways. The old notice board outside the diner, once cluttered with missing posters, now bore a new inscription carved into its wooden frame. "Every mystery has a voice." Locals began leaving flowers there. Not just for Clara, but for others whose names never made it into headlines. A young girl once left her school essay taped to the board, titled "The Girl Who Came Home After Everyone Forgot." It went viral online, sparking a wave of awareness about cold cases across the country. Soon, investigative teams from neighboring towns began reaching out to the Clara Weston Foundation for help reopening their own unresolved files. The ripples kept spreading. Detective Greer became somewhat of a ghost himself, still on duty, still quiet, but different now. He was no longer chasing closure, he was chasing truth that speaks. He revisited the Weston case file one last time before sending it to the archives. The folder was thicker now, filled not just with evidence, but with letters, handwritten notes from families thanking him for listening, for believing that silence wasn't the end. He looked at the final photograph of Clara, one taken posthumously for records. She wasn't smiling. But somehow, even in that still image, her eyes seemed alive, calm, defiant, luminous. He whispered quietly, "You were right, Clara. They did hear you." Outside the precinct, night had fallen. The cold air shimmered with faint snowfall. He pulled his coat tighter, walked down the street past flickering lampposts, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of unsolved cases pressing down on him. Instead, there was peace. Not the peace of ignorance, but the peace that comes after truth finally breathes. The Foundation's website would later publish a statement that captured the essence of it all. "Every mystery leaves behind a voice, and today, we've heard it." Those words became more than a tagline. They became a promise. A vow to keep searching, keep listening, and keep giving names back to the forgotten. Because in every case file sealed too soon, every missing person poster faded by rain, every unmarked grave lost to time, there's still a whisper waiting to be heard. And as the world turned, that whisper carried, softly, steadily, through the halls of Haverly Creek, through every precinct, through every cold case room where silence once reigned. It said one simple truth, the same one that guides every investigation under the Mystery Files banner. Every mystery deserves a voice. Months turned into years, and the town of Haverly Creek carried the echo of Clara Weston's name like a melody that refused to fade. The courthouse steps, once the scene of protests, journalists, and candlelight vigils, now stood as a quiet monument of resolve. The plaque mounted by the local council read, "In memory of Clara Weston, her silence spoke louder than fear." The trial of David Lawn had sent shockwaves far beyond the state line. His conviction, after decades of speculation and hidden corruption, became a case study for law students across the country. It exposed cracks in the system, misplaced files, ignored evidence, overlooked victims. But it also showed something else, how persistence and empathy could rewrite the narrative of justice itself. Detective Greer, now retired, would often be invited to lecture young officers. He never showed them photos of the crime scene. He showed them letters. Letters from families who had once been forgotten. Letters that said, "Because you listened, we found peace." He'd tell them, justice isn't a hammer that strikes once and moves on. It's a light that keeps searching, even in the dark corners where no one's looking. Across the street, at Haverly Creek High, students gathered every year for the Clara Weston Awareness Week. They studied forensic psychology, criminal profiling, and the ethics of investigative journalism. The memorial garden by the old science block, once a site of sorrow, now bloomed every spring with white lilies. That garden wasn't built to erase tragedy. It was built to remind people of the cost of silence. In one of his last interviews, Greer was asked if he ever regretted reopening the Weston file. He paused for a long moment, then smiled. "No," he said softly. "Because every time we gave a case a voice, another one answered back." He turned toward the old case board still hanging in his study. Dozens of faces looked back at him, men, women, children, frozen in time. And for the first time in decades, he didn't see victims. He saw stories that finally ended right. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of chimes from the memorial garden. It was almost as if the town itself was breathing again. And in that gentle sound, somewhere between the cold air and the quiet streets, Clara's presence lingered, not as a ghost, but as a symbol of what happens when truth finally finds its way home. Because justice, in the end, isn't just about punishment. It's about restoration. It's about letting the world remember the forgotten, and giving them back their rightful place in the story. And as always, beneath the cold shadows of every unsolved case, the promise of Mystery Files remains, steady, human, unwavering. Where every mystery deserves a voice.